From Uprising, Guided Close Read. Nearly a decade before the Triangle Fire, a fire at the Iroquois Theater in Chicago killed over 500 people because they couldn't get out of the building. Building codes for public spaces were changed in response to that tragedy. After the Triangle Fire, positive and lasting reforms occurred in worker safety. When details of the fire and conditions in the Ash building became public, people across the country protested for safer working conditions. Reforms made after the Triangle Fire are still followed in today's workplaces. In fiction, the narrator is the voice that tells the story. The author's choice of a narrator is called the point of view, which gives the readers a specific perspective on the story. The author uses third person limited, which has the following characteristics. The narrator is not a character and is outside the story. The narrator uses third person pronouns such as he, she, him, her, their. The reader sees the story events and other characters through the eyes of one character, who is often the main character of the story. Lines 7 through 10 are italicized to indicate internal dialogue, meaning this is what Yetta is thinking. Reread lines 7 through 10. What does this internal dialogue reveal about Yetta? Pause while you think. It reveals that Yetta is hard on herself and expects more accomplishment. Historical fiction is a type of story that is set in the past and includes real places and events. Authors base the stories on facts and research, but they use their imaginations to create scenes, dialogue, and sometimes even characters to tell the story. Reread lines 23 through 26. What does the author's description of the characters' actions reveal about the real-life working conditions at the factory? Pause while you think. Yetta and Jenny both stand up and stretch cramped muscles, unhunch rounded shoulders, and stamp their feet to wake up feet that had gone numb on the sewing machine pedal. This suggests that the work the women did was physically demanding and potentially damaging to their bodies. Think back to reading the excerpt from Flesh and Blood So Cheap. You may want to refresh your memory by rereading lines 21 through 30 of that selection. How did that description of the working conditions compare to this description? Pause while you think. The description in the informational text does not describe the effect of the conditions on the workers' bodies as the historical fiction does, but it allows readers to visualize the working conditions that make Yetta and Jenny feel the way they do. This is a fictionalized account of the Triangle Factory fire that you read about earlier in the collection. Lines 31 through 44 of the excerpt from Flesh and Blood So Cheap describe how the fire started. In lines 63 through 68 of Uprising, the author depicts the same event. Reread lines 31 through 44 of Flesh and Blood So Cheap, and then reread lines 63 through 68 of Uprising. Cite evidence of the similarities between the two accounts. Pause while you think. The cutters are smoking in each account, and the fire starts beneath a cutting table. How does the author's description of the scene in Uprising reveal it to be historical fiction? Pause while you think. Yetta is commenting on the cutters and what their smoking caused, as well as the fact that some of them had sense enough to keep water nearby. Authors reveal information about characters through text detail such as dialogue, the things the characters say out loud, actions, internal thoughts, and interactions with other characters. In this next section, the author depicts two different sides of Yetta's character. Reread lines 91 through 103. Describe what change in Yetta's character is depicted. Pause while you think. At first she's trying to help the others escape, but when she sees the woman fall out of the 8th story window, she panics and freezes, realizing she might die. The author describes the actions of one of the managers of the factory from Yetta's perspective. Reread lines 118 through 129. Identify why Yetta thinks she and Mr. Bernstein were on the same side. Pause while you think. He slapped and punched some of the hysterical girls to make them keep moving toward the doors, which is similar to what Yetta did to a couple of the women who were panicking. Remember that as historical fiction, Uprising is based on factual details of the Triangle Factory fire. Reread lines 91 through 96 of Flesh and Blood So Cheap, and then reread lines 161 through 165 of Uprising. Identify details that are similar in each account of the spreading fire. Pause while you think. Similarities: cans of oil, the oiled floor, finished shirtwaists, fabric scraps. The air itself seemed to catch fire. The air itself seemed to be on fire. The detail about the air seeming to be on fire is similar in both accounts. What would likely be the source of information for this detail that makes it a fact and not an image from the author's imagination? Pause while you think. The image that the air seemed to be on fire likely came from an interview or an account of someone who was on the 9th floor and survived the fire. A metaphor compares two unlike objects or ideas. Reread lines 202 through 204, in which the author uses a candle metaphor. Why did the author choose to use a candle metaphor for Yetta's life? Pause while you think. Yetta is caught in a fire, picturing religious candles melting. She had seemed afraid about the direction of her own life earlier in the story. Now she is afraid that her life will melt away like the wax in a candle. Continuing to compare and contrast genres, the author of Uprising is describing details that were also recounted in lines 5 through 7 of the excerpt from The Story of the Triangle Factory Fire. Reread lines 5 through 7 of the excerpt from the Story of the Triangle Factory Fire and lines 205 through 213 of Uprising. Cite examples of how Haddix took these details and expanded them into fiction. Pause while you think. The history writing briefly mentioned the detail doors that opened inward instead of outward, overcrowding in work areas, and block exits were also to blame. In Uprising, the author has added some details that expand on this to make the story come to life. Jacob jerked open the stairway door and it opened out, making another obstacle in the tiny vestibule. Authors use italicized text to show characters' thoughts. In third-person limited point of view, readers can see the interior thoughts of only the primary character the author has chosen. Reread lines 237 through 243. Why does Yetta feel compelled to warn the workers on the 9th floor? Pause while you think. Her friend Bella is on the 9th floor, but Yetta also feels responsible for her fellow workers because she is a union organizer. This section is told from the point of view of the governess for the children of one of the factory owners, Mr. Blank. A governess is a woman hired by families to educate and train the children. Shifting points of view allows Haddix to explore more deeply a character mentioned only in passing in an earlier point of the story, and tells the same story from another perspective. Reread lines 248 through 261. Cite evidence of Jane's relationship with her boss at the Blank household. Pause while you think. Here, the author is noting how Miss Milhouse usually reacts to the two Blank girls. The details are not in italicized print, so they are not shared as Jane's actual thoughts. The author, as narrator, is telling them to the reader. The author notes that Miss Milhouse would have scolded Harriet and praised Millicent. It's clear that Jane likes Harriet's exuberance and thinks Millicent is in danger of becoming a priggish bore. This suggests that Jane and her boss do not see eye to eye when it comes to dealing with the children, which might make Jane's job difficult for her. Authors use dialogue, written conversations between characters, to bring characters to life and reveal each character's personality. Reread lines 293 through 315. What is Jane's attitude toward Harriet's questions? Cite specific evidence in the passage to support your claim. Pause while you think. Jane tries to answer Harriet's questions directly and logically, saying there are scientific reasons that the elevator would not go through the roof. Then, when Harriet keeps asking more questions, Jane realizes she doesn't have the answers and says they'll have to research the answer at a bookstore. This suggests that Jane does not want to just dismiss or mislead Harriet the way Millicent does. The author describes a silent exchange between Jane and the elevator operator strictly from Jane's point of view. Reread lines 333 through 337. Explain why Jane gladly returns the elevator operator's wink. Pause while you think. Even though Jane works for a wealthy family, she feels she has more in common with the elevator operator, and this is a way to let him know that she's more like him than the boss's daughters. Remember that historical fiction has the advantage of allowing the author to take factual information and embellish the story to make it more engaging to the reader. Reread lines 21 through 27 from the history writing Flesh and Blood So Cheap, and then reread lines 388 through 400 of Uprising. How does the author's description of the pressing department on the 10th floor in Uprising make the facts presented in Flesh and Blood So Cheap more compelling? Pause while you think. The Uprising author makes the packed room seem even more difficult to work in, with hot irons and dangerous gas tubes overhead. The author also describes the workers looking weary. Third-person limited point of view allows the author to explore the character's thoughts and dreams without putting them in dialogue form with another character. In this next section, the author is limited to doing this for Jane only. Reread lines 406 through 411. Explain why the sight of the workers hunched over their irons agitated Jane and made her want to leave quickly. Pause while you think. Jane identified with the factory workers and had good friends who worked in the factory, so the sight of the workers reminded her that she is still like them, even though she works for the wealthy owner of the factory. She wants to leave quickly because the weekend means free time to do what workers want with their friends and families. Remember that authors often include details that reveal traits or qualities about a character without directly stating the traits or qualities. You can use these details to infer or make good guesses about the characters. Reread lines 468 through 470. Make an inference about Jane's relationship with Bella. Cite evidence to support your inference. Pause while you think. The author shows Jane's thoughts about Bella. No wonder Bella felt so overwhelmed coming here from her tiny village in Italy. This suggests that Jane is empathetic to her friend and can relate to Bella's feelings about the factory. Authors of historical fiction often use a wide range of sources when they write a story. They often add the historical details not only about the event they are writing about, but also about the time period of the event. They use these details to give a broader view into society at that time. Reread lines 480 through 486. Cite an example of a cultural detail that likely came from sources about the time period. Describe how this detail enhances the story. Pause while you think. The author includes a line from a song and explains through Jane's perspective that it was one of those popular songs that you heard everywhere nowadays. This shows that popular music seemed as important to young people of this time period as it is today. This makes it easier to relate to the young women in the factory. Remember that Jane is fond of Bella and is looking forward to spending time with her. Reread lines 504 through 507. Why might Jane decide to lie to Bella's boss? Pause while you think. Jane is in a good mood and may have decided to lie to Bella's boss in a playful way, not only to poke fun at him, but also to make a point about treating her friend fairly. Dramatic irony occurs when the reader knows something that a character in a story does not know. Because third-person limited point of view only permits the author to reveal one character's thoughts and perspective, it allows the author to create situations of dramatic irony. Reread lines 516 through 521. How do these lines create dramatic irony in the story? Pause while you think. Jane thinks she hears Yetta calling out to convince the girls to form a union, her dearest wish. But the reader knows that Yetta is trying to save the girls from the fire on the 8th floor. Again, Yetta's dearest wish at that time. A simile compares two unlike things using the word like or as. Authors use similes to provide information or insight about their characters. Reread lines 544 and 545. Cite evidence of a simile. What effect does the simile have? Pause while you think. She was penned in, just like a goat or a pig. Pigs and goats are penned before they're slaughtered. Bella feels like an animal waiting to die. Reread lines 546 through 555. What details reinforce this interpretation? Pause while you think. Bella refused to think of herself as a hog in a pen waiting to be slaughtered. The author's dramatic depiction of Bella and Yetta trying to escape the fire both brings the horrible real-life event to life and adds a human element to the facts of the tragedy. Reread lines 568 through 570. Then go back to the historical account in Flesh and Blood So Cheap to look for non-fiction evidence of what is described here in Uprising. Pause while you think. Lines 72 through 75 from Flesh and Blood So Cheap depict workers piled up at the doors. What details were added by the author of Uprising that bring this part of the story to life? Describe the impact of these details. Pause while you think. The author adds that Bella looked around frantically, which is probably how everyone on this floor is acting at the moment, frantic. These details heighten the suspense, adding a sense of true desperation felt by the characters in the fictional account. Let's look at another comparison between the Flesh and Blood So Cheap selection and the historic fiction of Uprising. Reread lines 212 through 223 of Flesh and Blood So Cheap. Then look at lines 606 to 616 of this story and tell how the fire escape collapse might have been depicted differently if the author were telling the story from Jane's perspective, looking out the window. Pause while you think. Because Jane was at the window and saw the fire escape fall, the author could have described some of the brutal deaths depicted in the nonfiction account. The author depicts a dilemma for Bella. Does she save her friend Jane, or does she save herself? Reread lines 659 through 671. Who does Bella save? Review the Bella section for evidence to support your answer. Pause while you think. Bella saves herself because earlier she says she refuses to die like an animal in the fire.